Good evening. Welcome to another evening in SCI-Arc's continuing Fall Design Forum. 2 notes before we start. Next Wednesday night, same time and place, November 10th, Dara Birnbaum will be here to discuss her work and show some of her work and some of her video pieces. She is an artist currently living in New York who evolved from early work in architecture and now is working with video. Secondly, we'd like to remind you that Danielle Liebskin's drawings will be on display in the Architecture Gallery just through this weekend. So if you haven't been by yet, do stop in. They're quite interesting. Tonight, it is a special event to have with us Raimund Abraham. When I talked with him earlier this summer, he told me that lectures are something that he does only occasionally. So we are very pleased to find that he felt SCI-Arc's series was enough of a reason to bring him to LA. Mr. Abraham is originally from Austria, and he currently lives and works in New York. Since 1971, he has been a member of the faculties of architecture at the schools of Cooper Union and Pratt Institute. He's participated in and received awards in numerous international competitions. He's exhibited his projects and his very evocative drawings throughout Europe and America. Poetry and metaphor, irony, collision, a concern with abstraction of archetypal forms. These are just some of the notions upon which Mr. Abraham constructs his own personal interpretation of architecture. Let's please give him a warm welcome.
Can we turn those lights off to see the slides a little better? How does this work here? Okay, that's better. And I have just one more request. Since don't be afraid that I'm going to read my lecture, but I would like to quote a few things. I'm just testing if I can see enough, okay? Yeah, that's all right. I actually become more and more reluctant to speak about architecture at my work because it's paradoxical to the way I work. I've chosen to more or less retreat from the present games which are played in the architectural world, particularly in New York, and have retreated to my studio where I pursue my experiments in architecture. But it is a time now where, and particularly when one teaches, that one almost feels obliged to speak out against the present trends and fashions and manipulations in architecture. And to me it was always a symbolic necessity that schools of architecture and students of architecture would form those pockets of resistance which are essential for the survival of any culture. But when I recently looked at the, I think it was an AIA magazine on, which featured the cross-section of student work throughout America, it was the most depressing, corrupted, opportunistic documentation of imitation of imitators. And this is to me very, I mean, it's frightening that the students would fall into the trap of sort of like magazine fame. As Andy Warhol has said already clearly almost 15 years, 20 years ago, that the time will come that everybody is going to be famous for 15 minutes. I think we are pretty close to that measure. So I will save, I think, my ideological polemic for tomorrow for UCLA. I think it's more appropriate there. And I will try to speak today more intimately about my work and how to make architecture, how I make architecture, and theoretical influences which have been very essential in my work. I also would like to comment just on the, as far as I recall, there's a theme about this lecture series, which is art and architecture. I always have resisted that kind of separation, because I think this, first of all, the separation occurred very late in the 19th century. Before, art was always, architecture was always a language through which one could either make art or could utilize for other profane purposes. So I think this separation is philosophically and ideologically misleading, and I would like to quote Friedrich Hegel from his writings about the arts, where he says, "The sensuous and the spiritual, which struggle as opposites in a common understanding, are revealed as reconciled in the truth expressed by art." And to me, this dialectical polarity between the sensuous and the spiritual, or the rational or intellectual and the physiological, is one of the fundamental forces in formulating any architectural thought. But to me, today, the problem is not a formal problem in architecture. It is an existential problem. It has to do with the questioning archaic principles and archaic criteria in the language of architecture. Formal speculations can never touch upon the essential. Forms have to be a result of questioning, a result of work, of labor, of imagination, of fear, and of anxieties. Forms cannot be borrowed. So my work is, from the beginning on, a search to test the limits and the boundaries of myself and the boundaries of architecture. And design, in my opinion, is only a secondary force which would reconcile the original intervention, where the ontological site, metaphorically spoken, is intervened with, and an architectural event is created. First, one has to dig a hole in the ground or make a mound, and secondary, you decide if this hole is round or this hole is square, or the mound is a cone or the mound is a pyramid. And I think it's the return to those questions, to the principal questions, even of simple elements. What is a window? What is a door? Even what is a doorknob? And an attempt to try to find the roots of those problems and those forms could lead to a new interpretation in architecture. But it's ultimately the return to those roots, and which is, in my work, a continuous struggle. It's a struggle with how to conquer place from the anonymity of space, and how to conquer time through the possibility of memory. It is to me, architecture is truly the possibility to signify the absence of man and not its presence. Its presence was necessary in the most primary event of conquest, the touch of the body, the shelter of the body, the shelter against the most primary forces. But it was the invention of creating a place through the absence of that body. That is, to me, the beginning of architecture. The other one doesn't seem to work. I'm sorry. Okay, so maybe you can push it, I push the other one and you can push the second one, okay? And as a consequence of the argument I just used before, there seem to me there are two forces which determine the existence of architecture. One is not like Joseph Rickwert claimed that the hut was missing in paradise, that made paradise incomplete. I believe that paradise was complete by itself, as a place by itself. But the invention of the house, after paradise was lost, became the substitute for paradise. So this idea, this desire to create one's own paradise, is rooted as a most elemental force in everybody. Everybody, in my opinion, has the sensibility and the power to make architecture. But it's an architecture which cannot be analyzed through rational means. It's not an architecture which can be manipulated with. It's not an architecture which can be used as a vernacular for cheap distortions and transformations. It is a spiritual, a very magical root of architecture, juxtaposed or polarized by the other root of a continuous and anonymous, independent development of technology, leading in its most extreme to a anonymous and technicized transformation of the idea house. So I think those two elements, the magical and the rational, are the continuous sources for any architecture. And if there is any hope for, what we would hope for, a new architecture, it will arise out of that polarity. And to me, it's the invention of geometry as a language to idealize physical matter is a device which would somehow try to complete the cycle from the physical world we are born into through the idealized world geometry would provide, and the physical world again, physicalized again, so this full cycle would be completed. But geometry, and there I use a definition by the Austrian philosopher Ernst Mach, who was very influential in my theoretical work, who defines architectural space as a polarity between physiological space, which is defined by the limits of the senses which one can perceive it, the tactile, the visual, the odor space, and the rational or geometric space, which is by its own nature and as a pure invention of the mind, the infinite space. So again, the polarity of those two definitions of the physiological space, going back to the elementary roots of touch, the primary perception of space, to the invented rational condition of the geometric space. I believe that geometry can never truly generate an architectural event because it doesn't have memory. Memory comes only into being when it collides with matter, when geometry has the task to idealize the amorphous condition of the body. And then ultimately coming to that ontological side I spoke before, where any architectural intervention has to be rooted in, and that is the side of the horizon, where the sky and the earth collide, and where the horizon line itself does neither belong to the sky nor does it belong to the earth. And any intervention, either you dig down into the ground or build up into the sky, would be the beginning of architecture. And I somehow try to show those images and those theoretical investigations as phenomena which are persistently influenced my work, but not in a very conscious way. I mean, when I work in architecture, when I make architecture, I think in architecture. When I theorize, I don't limit myself at all to forms of inspiration. If I read books or I look at paintings, but none of those other languages would have a direct, a conscious effect upon the architectural form, the architectural concept I develop. But it's a dialogue. It's almost a dialogue between two complete separate processes of thinking and making. As, for example, talking about my work is also a very independent, autonomous way of looking at my work, and in a way it has nothing to do with my work. So in that sense I become, and sometimes very uncomfortably, a historian of my own makings. I have, when I started out my work in architecture after I graduated from school, I started out as probably the majority of architects start out to try to get the commission and try to build architecture. Exactly what I did. But I realized after a very short time that what I did was simply a intuitive reaction to what I knew, what I felt about architecture, without having a true philosophical base to return to in that process of experimentation. And I departed very early in 1960, 1961, where I started to challenge the conventions of architectural thinking, the conventions of practicing architecture, and to become autonomous, in the sense, autonomous, independent of commissions, independent of the profession, and try to create architectural images and concepts which I wanted simply to use to create that philosophical basis, that knowledge, when I finally would return to build architecture. So those stages of drawings and writings I went through were all in anticipation of a built form, because I also believe there is, so to me drawings are not incomplete stages toward the built form, but they are independent, autonomous ends by themselves, simply expressed through different means, but they all carry that latency of being materialized. They carry the sense of material. So for me a drawing is not a graphic representation. For me a drawing is a process of construction. I use very often very hard paper, parchment, which I have to almost like scratch with the lead of my pencil. That means it's an intervention, almost the paper becomes a landscape and the line becomes a scratch in that landscape, a cut. And when I use color pencil or when I shade, I simply try to, while the line for me is the expression of the intellect, the expression of geometry, the texture, the shading, the color is an anticipation of the material. It's anticipation of matter, of the physiological part of architecture. And right now I'm at a point where I return to the built form in architecture. I will try to show in the sequentially sort of like excerpts chronologically from my architectural investigation to the most recent projects which are supposed to be built in Berlin. And this one is a project for the new Anthology Film Archives in New York, where an old courthouse, a freestanding old courthouse, had been acquired by Jonas Makers, and this is the first stage of my architectural proposition, which is the demolition of the various parts which are taken out. So I simply want to demonstrate that more or less the deepest architectural sensibilities in my work come from material itself, come from the tactility of architectural space. And it might very well have to do with my own personal memories, which go back to the place I grew up, which was in the Tyrolean mountains. And the only way to survive there, one had to conquer that site. One had to conquer the mountains by climbing them. One had to conquer the slopes by skiing down, and to conquer the woods by cutting the wood. And so I think this sensibility one carries, and I think everybody does that, carries always through one's life and through one's work. So now the return to a built form is nothing new to me, but it occurs at a point when I had completed, in a sense, my investigations through drawings and other means of making architecture. It is also an interesting fact that, for example, the Berlin project, which I will show you later, at that early stage, I do not use my my sensuous work of drawing. I return to a very anonymous way of drawing in ink and building models, which not even I do myself sometimes, simply to investigate or develop the conceptual principle and then work toward the implementation of that building, then through the richness of the sensibility of drawing which I had developed in my other work. In the very early 60s, I started out in Vienna at the same time as Archigram started to make their autonomous work in London and the Metabolist in Japan. So in Vienna were more or less 3 people who started at the same time: Hans Hollein, Walter Bichler, and myself. And those projects were, in the true sense, projects which were intended to be a provocation to the convention of architecture in a formal sense, in a sociological sense, and in a cultural sense. And I will just read a passage I've written for this series of cities, where, of course, the metaphor did not imply the intent to impose or to believe in a realization of those concepts. They should be seen as visual poems, autonomous poems, where they would provoke associations which a possible sociological or formal change of the city. Cities, altars of mechanical intestines, split open abysses, radiating tunnels, piled up, earthen containers, humans on rollers, spheres, kinetic volumes in space moving sidewards without direction, encapsulated by the darkness of ever-growing plants, crystallized, pulsating in continuous movement of the subterranean parts, of mechanical spectacles displaying the corpses of animals, plants, humans, laying out in state, elevated above the wonderful chaos of concrete cubes, cones, sewers, cathedrals, brothels beneath the surface, slaughterhouses, coffins on conveyors, windowless at the bottom of sun craters, buildings on the crossroad, circular buildings, cantilevers without function, junctions of cylindric linear bridges, penetrating mountains of luminous spheres, radiating artificial rainbows, vertical buildings growing toward the light of mechanical suns, senseless, empty plains, streets, rings of gallows encircling the gigantic womb of the inner parts of the city. At the same time, when I was still working on those concepts of universal cities or compact cities, as I called them at that time, this is the wrong slide on the, but it's probably my mistake. Okay. I returned to the scale of a singular house, still very much obsessed with the imagery of machines. In that sense, I have to point out, I was never interested in the machine as a mechanism to provide better conditions of living or better means of making architecture, but I was intrigued by the monumental formal qualities of machines, by their differences of spatial, intricate spatial interiors. And so this influence, this obsession with the machines, I tried to convey through a very small house, which consisted of an entrance which was made out of concrete as a reflection to the gravitational property of the ground. It's sitting in the ground, while from there on, like a rocket, out into the open void of the site, reach this very mechanical shelter of the habitational part of the house. The house, which was financed by a student of mine at the time, was then finally, the project was abandoned when his mother saw the project and sort of cut the funds short. But it was, to me, interesting was the discovery, and at that time I wasn't that conscious about what I feel today almost a necessity, that in any architectural composition, each fragment, each part has to retain its formal autonomy. So it is interesting to see that the entrance, which was always, when I developed the house, part of the total architectural concept, became an independent fragment, became a monument, an entrance to the site which you can never enter. So it means it simply remained in its abstraction a symbol of the memory of the house, with the main part of the house absent. It was the first time, which became later a very consistent vocabulary, that I did not want to enter the spatial membrane of a building through its membrane, but rather would go through the ground, experiencing the horizon of the ground, and then would re-emerge in the inside of the house. And here is the first time that where I tried sort of to manifest that principle of that a conscious experience of the horizon, of the departure from the horizontal into the man-made interior. And from that project on, still obsessed by the aesthetical presence of the machine, I tried to explore the possibilities of a dynamic architecture where the membrane of the house would become completely anonymous, would simply signify its functional meanings, and the interior would be reduced to a mechanical skeleton which would provide a almost infinite number of combinations of the habitational platforms. And again, I was much more interested in the former dynamic quality of that interior skeleton than in the social possibilities of responding to, almost in a perfect sense, to a program of habitation. And in that process of those investigations of the dynamic properties of architecture, I moved into the domain of electronics as almost like what I would call the invisible machines, where I tried to demonstrate that by reducing, in that sense, retrospectively to me, it's very interesting to see that one can utilize any advanced technology without getting entrapped in a technological solution, that one can undermine more or less the anonymity of machines and utilize them for for completely different means. And my intent was in those two temporal environments, one at the Architectural League in New York and the other one, the second one, at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, where I tried to utilize that invisible machines, the invisible electronic devices, antennas which would detect the proximity of bodies, where the intent was simply to reduce the physicality of space and amplify the physicality of the body, the physicality of the presence of man. And besides that, of course, an attempt to create a total architectural space by incorporating all perceptual sensations one can receive, from change of temperature to touch and sound. All those devices were integrated with sounds, and one could actually use the space as an instrument by which any interference of a singular participant would create a change of the architectural space. And in the reversed version, in terms of, of geometric and physiological definition of space, the one in Stockholm, where the space was physicalized, almost where a triangular room was filled and then cut, but where, in a more immediate sense, the body, through its simple movement, through various parts or zones of that environment, would transform the spatial properties of the place itself. Which then would lead to almost like a reduction of architectural space to objects of space themselves, to objects which carry memory of the body, which carry, as a chair would to me signify as much the absence of the one who sits and the presence, and an attempt to use the inner properties of that object, for example, like the axis, which is inherent in the body as in the object, would become the transforming device to transform a utilitarian object into an architectural site. And then to one of my favorite projects, also one of my very few realizations in the last years, was my own toilet in my loft in New York, where I discovered that I could see from the window of the room which I had designated for the bathroom, I could see the Empire State Building, one of the most beautiful monuments in the city has ever produced. And I tried to utilize one of the most common but also most precise devices in urban design, the visual axis. And simply by synchronizing the idea of physical relationship of two places within the infrastructure of the city, and creating a perceptual focus and relating, let's say, a profane activity to a spiritual one. I also tried to demonstrate that one of the I would say most devastating attitudes in functionalist architecture, simply the elimination of the bathroom as part of the habitational ritual, had, I think, tremendous effect upon the quality and nature of buildings, of houses, and particularly of collective houses, of housing. And so, without, of course, the obvious irony of the project, there is a symbolic attempt made to show that the bathroom has to, or the activity of the bathroom has to be as much a significant part of the habitation ritual as anything else. I was wondering, in the terminology of a house, what a living room is. And I think, one really has to coming back to my very early statement at the beginning, that one has to question the terminology, not only the former propositions in architecture, but the terminology of architecture. One is to question what is a bathroom, what is a bedroom, what is a living room. And I would say that this questioning and this probing of rather accepted terms could lead to a complete new sensibility in making architecture, and particularly making the house. And almost as a, could we focus that a little bit here? That's still not. Okay. And almost as a synthesis of those investigations I had shown before, particularly the idea that the body of the participant would not be simply an accidental appearance in the in architecture space, but would actually become a very a physical factor in transforming that space. I developed this project of the house without rooms, and this leads to a whole series of houses. I mean, as much metaphorically, to be seen as much metaphorically as the metaphor city for the earlier project. And I would like to read what I consider the program of a house. Those projects were developed in between 1970 and 1975. The house is the junction of dreams, illusions, death, birth, mutations, feasts, contemplation, rituals, conflicts, confrontations, destruction, execution, love, hate, fury, memory, desires, wounds, satisfaction, paralysis, intimacy, distance, ecstasy, mourning, density, absurdity, resurrection, contentment, lust, sleep, wakening, coldness, flesh, the morning, the day, light, anticipation, the night, the spring, the winter, the summer, the autumn, fire, ice, water, earth, flames, mountains, abysses, metamorphosis, flowers, odors, spices, clouds, stones, rivers, the wind, the sun, the stars, the moon, the soft, the metallic, the stony, the woody, the glassy, the crystalloid, gestures, faces, movements, penetration, openings, burials, isolation, protection, wombs, walls, intestines, spheres, cubes, voids, squares, transparencies, transcendence, planes, depressions, erections, the skies, the subterranean, the horizon, infinity. So the house becomes a monument of the ritual of habitation. A space is reduced to a pure tactile experience. Perspective is almost eliminated. Vision is framed by the walls themselves, and passages are barely permitted for the body to move through. And at places where the body can rest, where the body participates in the basic rituals of habitation, the body becomes the physical force to change the property of the house itself, while the inner part of the house is the symbolic reflection of the skeleton. The outer sides of the house is the armor, symbolic protection of the fragility of the body which moves inside. And it is the power of the body which succeed in penetrating from the skeleton to the wall to signify its own presence. And again, the autonomy of the elements themselves, of the skeleton as the rational and geometricized inner structure of the house, and the soft inner surface of the outer shells, both reflecting in their own independent formal presence, their own independent meaning. Then the house defined by a pure architectural theme of elements, known elements as the curtain, but transformed by simply exposing the curtain as an archetypical element of habitation to the outside, expose it to the power of the wind, expose it to the power of light, and through that very factual transformation create that kind of distorted, surreal imageries. I was interested in those series of houses. Also, to me, for example, the house with curtains is a manifestation of the autonomy of drawing in architecture. I would never want to build that house. I would rather have the curtains fly permanently in the wind. It also shows that the reality of the independence of drawing as making architecture. So it's not a stage toward a completion, it is an end by itself. A house with permanent shadow, where a simple independent slab, a wall, the only function to intervene with the landscape, becoming sign and entry for the house, would throw a shadow, and the power of the shadow would create the transparent surface of the house. Independent symbolic surface and roof for the habitational properties of the house. Again, the attempt of creating that collision, which I try to carry in different forms through all my work, is that collision between the rationality and fragility of geometric form, in most purest form signified through the material of glass, colliding with the amorphous, gravitational, heavy condition of the ground, of the earth. The house for the sun, and the house with two horizons. And the house with path, where that the metaphor of collision becomes a literal collision, where actually the house itself, the geometric parts of the house, through its projections to the landscape, would collide with that landscape, and the path it would cut would become the intervening property of the house itself, leading then to maybe the synthesis of this series of houses and of the metaphor of collision. For the project I did for the Biennale in Venice 1976, where the American contingent had to conform to a collective theme of suburban, I think it was called suburban alternatives. And to me the suburb was always one of the most mysterious environments I've ever entered, the most exotic one in terms of my own memory, of my own culture where I come from. And I will never forget the first image I had of America when the airplane coming from Europe would break through the clouds over Long Island. I would see the first time the very powerful and very alien formation of houses, and each house was, despite its collective density of the layout, would signify the independence, the autonomy of that single paradise which each of those inhabitants tried to create. So I approached the problem of suburb or suburban alternatives as a purely symbolic one, where I tried to create an archetype of house, a house which would signify all those houses as models for a paradise. And they would then collide, this archetype house solidified distorted from its original habitation meaning to a monument of a house, would then collide 7 times, and I called my project 7 Gates to Eden, would collide 7 times with 7 themes of my own desire for my own paradise. And now it is more or less to try to demonstrate that kind of a transitional development of ideas from a pure conceptual, I mean in terms of my own intent, state of making architecture into the realm of building, into where I've reached now a point where I have returned, as I see it, to a site which carries collective memory again. All the sites of the houses were sites which were created by myself, by my own fantasy, by my own desire, determined by my own memories. Now I return again to sites of a particular city, belonging to a particular culture and belonging to a particular collective memory. The first project of that return to a real site was a project for the Congress Hall in Berlin, which you probably all know has been designed and by Hugh Stubbins in 1957, has been built as a symbol of Western freedom and power against the East, and has collapsed about 2 years ago, I think 1980, in a most pathetic way. I mean, it also somehow demonstrated the impotence of modern or contemporary buildings to become ruins. So it was actually a very partial collapse. Only one of those pre-stressed beams fell down, and part of the roof membrane sort of hung down like a curtain along the outer wall, round wall of the Congress Hall. So I tried to make a proposal, of one hand, to create a very pure, in an architectural sense, monumental form, demonstrating a collision between the indigenous forms of the original building with a idealized form of a quartered cube. On the other hand, I tried also to demonstrate that this monument could also provide a continuous use of the hall by simply removing the original membrane and providing a new space which would be formed by the cube, providing light to illuminate the inner parts through the cuts of the quarters. And I would like to talk about more specifically about the 2 latest projects which I have developed in the last 3-4 years, and of 2 different sites, places with a very different cultural memory. One is Venice and the other one is Berlin. The Venice project started 1978 as an invitation to make a proposal for a particular site next to the train station. It was organized by the University of Venice and by the City of Venice. And it was maybe the most difficult city for me, the most difficult collective site to return, because Venice maybe is one of those complete architectural sites where one sees no way, neither of a conceptual nor physical intervention. But in the process of studying, I discovered that through already interventions made in the 19th and 20th century, there were certain wounds cut into the body of the city, which could lead to an architectural intervention reflecting both the admiration for the mystique of the place, and an uncompromising proposal of an ideal architecture. Also, Venice to me was always a city which became literally an architecture reduced to a horizon line, where the sky and the water would somehow compress, where the city itself would become that physical line between the most ontological elements of the architectural site, and the anonymity of the infrastructure only broken by the monuments of the churches. There's also the memory of the beginning of the city, and it's very curious that since the Middle Ages, no plan of Venice would show the vectors which created the topography of the city itself, namely the hidden rivers of the lagoon. The lagoon appears to be a monolithic body of water surrounding and cutting through the city. In actuality, the lagoon is very shallow, and only those rivers would provide passages for navigation. So there's this ambiguous presence of hidden elements which would represent in any other city the network of highways and roads. The site which was designated for the intervention was the site next to the train station, which still is defined by a very, intact historical crust along the Canareggio Canal and the Canal Grande, but has been totally mutilated alongside the train station. It's also the same site Corbusier had planned his hospital, reaching out from that end condition into the lagoon. And I proposed a city within the city, which was structured around 3 squares, which were as ideal elements superimposed upon certain historic elements which are retained as elements of archaeological memory to generate that tension again between the physiological parts of architectural space and the rational one, which is represented through the grid, which would radiate from those squares. Those buildings, which had been designated for destruction, which were anonymous industrial buildings from the 19th century, I retained their imprints in the ground to become those elements which then would intervene or collide with the rational elements of my own architecture. One square for the people, the square for the artisans, and square for solitude, where the single house represented the monument for the single inhabitant, could only be reached to the canal which would cut through that square. But the infrastructure itself was generated by a prototypical house which through its own architectonic composition would generate then on a larger scale the network of passages and the network of those skeletons which would define the rational grid of the city, which then would again on the smaller scale intervene and collide with the historic fragments. So again, I wanted to show a new principle of an urban transformation, where the smallest element, the house itself, would generate the larger scale spaces of the city. And in addition to that designated site, I try to discover sites which reflected that notion of wounds, of mutilations caused in the process of 19th century interventions in the city. And I made a proposal of 2 other symbolic institutions for the city. One the hospital as a counter-reaction to Corbusier's hospital, which always I considered the hospital of the absence of pain, that I tried to symbolize through that hospital the notion that the hospital or any other institution would derive from the house, that in the house as the ontological place of human existence, of human culture, where birth and healing and death and education would have the origins, I proposed a hospital which would signify the three metaphysical conditions of that place. One of birth, so the houses of birth are the cubes which were land-bound, the house of hope, where the houses of birth would penetrate, would project through, would create gates of entry and exit, and the houses of no return, which would float in the lagoon and would project themselves backwards to form the gates toward the lagoon. Then the wall of lost journeys as an attempt to recreate the original solidity of the wall where the train station was built, and the Tower of Wisdom as a symbol of a library on the northern edge of the city. Berlin was a familiar return. It was a evocation of memory which I had experienced as a child during the war, where I had witnessed myself destruction, where I had witnessed my own fears of survival. And when I returned to Berlin in 1957, it was a return to those memories. The city was still in ruins. One still could, sense the dimension of destruction which took place, and also, but still sensed the spirit of hope. Because I believe that, and this is to me as an understanding of existential conditions of man, that hope and despair are inseparable, but optimism and pessimism are opposed to each other. And this was a time when the wall had not been built yet, where the city was latent to be rebuilt, and it was that presence of hope that made that place so special. And my second return, many years later, about 4 years ago, I was witnessed the most destructive reconstruction of a city one could imagine. And this was the city I had returned to make a proposal for my own reaction, my own propositions of making architecture at that place. The city itself, the historical development was based on two very simple ideal geometric forms. One, the triangle emerging from the circular space of the Marienplatz, and then with the central axis of Friedrichstraße, where you saw the Mies, where Mies proposed his glass skyscraper, colliding perpendicular with the main axis under the Linden, which was the first ideal axis the city started to develop around. And so there was a very clear typology of axes, of cuts, and of very solid blocks which defined the edges of those cuts. To the right you see the amount of destruction which had taken place during the war, where simply very few historic fragments were left to be integrated in a new urban typology. But the context of this building exhibition is supposed to somehow repair the wounds the city has suffered during the war by one hand integrating the historic elements and trying to hide the damage which has been done through the reconstruction in the last 20 years. So there were those two ideal typologies which I recognized and used as the basis for my proposal. One, the axis of the cities, the cuts through the body of the city, and the block defined by the edges of the building themselves. I tried to develop within that framework a typology of elements which would signify and symbolize the various conditions of the block. One, which became the major element, was the corner, the bridge which would connect the corner as the new element, a new fragment with the old fragments, and then the new fragments themselves. So I developed a corner element which not only tried to reflect the complexity of the corner as a defining element for the intersection of four different streets, but also reflect the inner properties of the yard. But I also tried to symbolize through that broken line the ruinous memories of the destruction. And again, the framework, which was formed by the vertical elements, the vertical towers of vertical circulation, and the bridges, the roof bridges as horizontal circulation, provided then that framework between the historic fragments and the new fragments to form finally the new edge of the block, where I also tried to symbolize external forces like major axis of the Anhalter Bahnhof, which would then collide and would be signified through two freestanding towers, which would then create a gate in the scale of the city leading to the inner parts, which to a certain extent were those accidentally randomly built schools from the 50s and 60s. So I proposed in the inner courtyard of the block almost like a imaginary land. The tower, the freestanding tower, and finally the completed edge with the frame and the new fragments which were plugged in. In architectural detail, despite the fact that this is a rather simplistic volumetric representation of the final proposal, I try to challenge again the conventions of the elements of window, of the elements of door, of the element of roof, and try to reinterpret those elements which I consider the archetypes of architectural vocabulary and of architectural grammar, and only the questioning of those elements could lead to a new architecture. I also believe, and this is something that I think is essential to understand, that modern architecture did not provide us with a new treatise or a new style. New architecture, modern art, was provided the first time in history, a critique of itself, critique of history, and so it created a cut through a accepted continuous process or evolution, which in actuality consists of very much unrelated cuts of singular events, and it provided us the first time with a very radical, clear look at other historic events. So I consider myself in that tradition truly a modern architect, because I believe that at that point we are at the beginning of modern architecture and not at the end of modern architecture. And I believe that the present ideological manipulations, particularly the use of isms, is not going to create a dent in the continuity of history. Because I believe that form is always stronger than formalism. And modern is stronger than modernism, and individual is stronger than individualism. And this is now the more specific development of two projects coming out of the general proposal of my competition project. One representing a corner element, a symbolic corner element, one a infill element carrying the idea of courtyard as a historic vocabulary of the city of Berlin. While the first corner, which I proposed for the competition, was proposed for collective use, general collective use, communal use. The new corner is a residential building, and I tried, without jeopardizing the pragmatic requirements of the program, to lose my desire to signify the monumental properties of the corner I developed in the first place to create a new typological element for the block of the city. I also tried to overcome the conventional definition of facade, where I tried to develop a topographical landscape by which one could sense the transition from the outside, from the street to the balcony to a double glass winter garden to the interior space. Also a clear articulation between the vertical monumental properties of the corner to the softer parts of the wings, which then would be the connecting elements to the adjacent historic buildings. The function of the corner element to become an integral part of an infrastructure without relying at all to eclectic elements, a rejection of the traditional interpretation again of window, where I tried to develop a different scale landscape of the elements which provide for vision and illumination, but trying to amplify certain elements which are of an essential significance to the historic buildings, for example, certain particular horizontal lines and rhythmic lines. So a reduction of the properties of the existing historic architecture to its most elemental syntax. And as I said before, at that stage I returned to a very anonymous language of representation of a single ink line and of models as a beginning to work toward now a total reversal of the earlier attempts, and working now from the abstract conceptual stage toward the physical stage of a finally built building. The courtyard building, or the gatehouse, where I tried to cut the building into two halves, and the cut would be a continuation of the street space leading to the courtyard, and the cylindrical form as a very conscious juxtaposition toward the adjacent square courtyards of the historic buildings, also signifying a pivoting point, a turning point, which either would return back to the street or would go through the diagonal gate to the gardens in the back. Again, the same idea of of the facade as landscape, as layerings, where there is a transitional sequence of elements which are become also protective screens toward the public space of the street, leading to the more intimate spaces of the inner courtyard and the inner habitational spaces. And again, the independence, autonomy of the elements themselves, of the cuts, of the halves of the building, of the separation of the outer parts which hang perpendicular to the axis of the cut, and in that sense don't touch the glass. In that sense, leading to the diagonal structural elements of the facade. And then the function of the gatehouse as a connecting device, where the two halves would function as the elements which would then create the continuity of the topography of the street itself. Could we focus that a little bit? And this is the last project I'm still working on, which is a church on the Berlin Wall. And I did a project out of my own initiative while I was waiting until the bureaucratic mechanism would finally make the building of the other projects possible. And it was also a result of a desire to overcome more or less the profanity of the programs for the buildings of the building exhibition, which are to about 99% residential units. And there's also I made the discovery that the West had not responded symbolically at all to the building of the wall. In that sense, I'm not talking about the political consequences of the war. I'm simply talking about the phenomena that a city is cut into two halves where the wall creates another side. In that sense, it doesn't matter if you are in the East or in the West, but it is a definite monumental experience of having a architectonic cut made which would create that kind of tension of those two sides. And so I proposed the church symbolically as a building with a spiritual program, and at the same time as a provocation to the presence of the war, which is signified on the east through the so-called death strip, where fortifications, tank fortifications and landmines are placed, and the anonymity of the western side. So this church to me signifies two elements which have very definite memory in the history of architecture. One is the war, and the other one is the bridge. And the bridge, which becomes the inner theme of the church, is an element metaphorically. We would show rather the intent to bridge than to complete the process of bridging. In that sense, the bridge as a metaphor would try to connect the profane with the spiritual, the given with the impossible. The architectonic composition is based on that principle of walls which explode and form the external idealized, purified architectural element of the church, and then the two amorphous bodies which represent the physiological part, the sheltering part of the church, while the bridge itself would be the element which would carry the congregation and the altar. The two walls which signify the symbolic character of the church is the wall facing the Berlin Wall and the wall which is entrance and exit for the church. Both walls are identical in their architectonic definition, but the entrance wall, one experiences the cut in the wall as a dark imprint in a white plane. When you enter the church, you would see the wall facing the Berlin Wall as a dark plane with a white imprint of the opening, with the light permitting to fall in the church directly. And the layering of those elements, the left one is never really in focus, if we could try to. On one hand is that very physiological sensibility of the outer amorphous bodies, which create that compression to signify the linear qualities of the bridge, and also forming the imprints into the ground, and then the very fragile, almost transparent quality of the walls themselves. They're very clear in the section, the distinction between the geometric idealized elements of the walls and the physiological boundaries of the interior space, whereby the slanted roof surface of those elements would provide a very soft illumination of the inner parts. And then ultimately, when the church would project its own shadow onto the other side, it would both signify its symbolic memory, as well as it would unify the architectural composition of its verticality and its horizontality. And with that, I would like to end my lecture with a quote by George Kubler about style. Everything varies, both with time and by place, and we cannot fix anywhere upon invariant quality such as the idea of style supposes, even when we separate things by their setting. But when duration and setting are retained in view, we have shifting relations, passing moments, and changing places in historic life. Any imaginary dimensions of continuities, like style, fade from view as we look for them. Style is like a rainbow. We can see it only briefly, while we pause between the sun and the rain, and it vanishes when we go to the place where we thought we saw it. Thank you very much. Is there sort of a question-answer session? I mean, don't feel guilty. I don't like question-answer sessions anyhow. So if you don't do any, yes.
How do you feel about your pieces as they get closer towards being built? Do they still have the? I mean, when you're looking at in the model and in the ink drawings, do they still have the emotive quality for you?
Yeah, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But I think I thought I made it very clear that the form they're in right now is for me a beginning. That I mean, I choose very consciously much more anonymous means of presentation as I would use in my architecture, which is an end by itself. So it's now, to me, it has to oscillate between the present state of more or less anonymous drawings, anonymous models, toward the complete state of architecture, where then work increase again more or less my sensuality of representation toward the completion of the work. So in that sense, one cannot compare the representation quality of those models and those drawings with the other drawings that I've made. And so there's also a very clear distinction between the church, which is again an autonomous project. It's not, there's no, neither an intent nor a hope that it will be built. Yes? Yeah, I really hate that term. It became, I would say, a cliche to point into maybe a certain it's primarily used, I would say, there was always labels. Like when we did the earlier city project in the 60s, they were labeled as visionary, or all those labels somehow are used to separate those projects and those people who make those projects from the mainstream of architecture. So it was always a device to separate. You know? I mean, poetry, there's a metaphor of poetic, which is more or less an intent, and I think anybody who wants to imagine, anybody who wants to create, is in that sense poetic. If one goes beyond the profanity of utilitarian life, one makes an attempt to be poetic. In that sense, it is true. But I don't consider the writings I've done as poetry. They were rather, I rather try to express through the means of language, of written language, the same kind of intensity as I tried to express through my drawings. So there might be, of course, an influence of maybe poetry I admire, but I'm not that conscious about making poetry when I write those things. I rather try to condense my thoughts as metaphors and not as a narrative explanation of things. But maybe I would like to say something, in connection with this poet. There's also something, seems to be a qualitative attachment to imagination. And I think everybody has imagination, everybody. Otherwise I would not teach. If I would not believe that every single student has the same possibilities of making architecture as I do, I would not teach. And what I believe is that it has to do with courage. See, imagination has to do with courage. Because it jeopardizes your physical survival if you think and if you imagine. And that's why so few people are imaginative. And I think it's simply a question, and this is also labor. You have to labor. Things don't float, ideas don't float around. You have to lift the stone and see what's under the stone, and then you dig further and then you find something else, and you just have to keep digging. And everybody has that possibility, and everybody has that power. And why there are so few people, unfortunately, around is because very few have the perseverance, and the courage to do so. But I must tell you, I'm very happy to be here. It's a very good feeling in this room, and which is very rare. Thank you very much.